So
there we go. All right. Well, hello, everyone. And as I said, it's a delight to be with all of you. I'm going to actually talk about climate first and then move into how debt is such a critical, dealing with debt is such a critical part of actually dealing with climate. And so let's begin with why climate change is such a problem, specifically in terms of developing countries, and it's really because of inequality. Okay, and that inequality has two aspects. There is the spatial aspect between the core countries and the rest of the world, and there is the vertical aspect, that is within each country, the elites, the rich, the big companies and the rich. And what's really happening today is that the core countries, in which one of which you're resident in, and the global rich, are able to produce and consume in what is essentially an imperialist way, which is to say they are grabbing the resources. In this case, the resource would be, if you like, a global carbon budget. And so they have the rising ecological footprints, they have rising shares of global carbon emission, they actually are rising. And we all know that the resulting climate change affects developing countries more than the rich countries, even in terms of the natural disasters and the geophysical changes. But what's also making it worse is that the international negotiations that are dealing with climate change, the COPs, right, the Conference of Parties, are deceptively unequal. And they're actually debilitating. Now, I think nobody was surprised that the last COP was debilitating because it was actually in an oil exporting country. But in fact, pretty much after Paris, most of the COPs have actually been increasingly unequal and unfair to developing countries. At the same time, we've got global financial markets and fiscal strategies of the major advanced economies that are increasing carbon emissions. And I'm going to show you how. And at the same time, the required finance for the rest of the world, for mitigation and for adaptation, are simply not there. And meanwhile, we have very privatized knowledge monopolies, the intellectual property regimes that are now dominating in practically every productive sector. And most of humanity, as a result, cannot access the technologies that we need to confront the climate challenge, either for mitigation or adaptation. And of course, the other aspect of mitigation is that it requires new resources. So we're getting new resource grabs for the strategic minerals, for the lithium, for the rare earths, for the copper, and so on. And so there's new forms of extractivist competition among the leading powers. And of course, the leading powers now also includes China. So how does it work? You see, the problem really is that this is a global problem, right? I mean, climate change is not looking at visas and passports and national borders. Nonetheless, we deal with it in terms of the national level. So every country is assigned a climate responsibility based on the current national carbon emissions. And that these are what you go and negotiate in the COPs, okay? Now, one problem is that this ignores historic responsibility. So clearly, we have a problem today because there has been a past history of generating emissions. But also, it relies on what I call purchasing power parity, PPP, measures of GDP. That is, it's an exchange rate, which is not the real exchange rate, the one that we all know, the one that we deal with, but it is a constructed exchange rate, which is supposed to estimate the purchasing power of a particular currency. And it typically overstates, it inflates the incomes of poorer countries. And so poorer countries are essentially told that they are richer than they are, and they have more of an ability to make the investments for climate change than they actually do. And then, of course, the measures themselves of the current carbon emissions are based on production rather than consumption. Yet we know that the North has managed to shift a lot of the production to other countries. And therefore, they are consuming much more carbon-intensive products, even though they are not necessarily produced within them. And then, of course, as a result of all that, the recent increases in total carbon emissions are used to blame some countries, especially China and India. China is now the largest emitter. India is the third largest emitter. The US, which was the largest emitter, is now number 2. Okay? But of course, these are relying on total carbon emissions, not per capita. So let's think of the significance of carbon debt. One estimate, there are different estimates, but here's one estimate that says that around 80% of global cumulative carbon emissions over the past 1.5 centuries comes from the rich countries of today, which is basically 14% of the global population. Now, remember, this is just how much carbon was produced through production within those borders. And it leaves out all the indirect carbon debt because of colonial trade and exploitation, what the colonial powers managed to extract from a whole range of developing countries. But you could say, well, that's okay. But, in 1850, nobody knew that carbon was a thing. Nobody knew that it was wrong to emit carbon. And you can't blame previous generations for things that we didn't know about. That's absolutely true. But in fact, more than half of these historical emissions occurred only in the last 30 years. That is from 1980 onwards. And by then, everybody knew. We have strong evidence now that whether it's the White House or Europe, everybody knew that this was a problem. And yet, that's when more than half of the historical emissions have occurred. If we look, as I said, China is the largest emitter in total terms. India is the third largest emitter. And they are generally, because there's been a massive increase in their emissions, they are being blamed for the recent problems, if you like, in the fact that we're not controlling the climate. But if you look at per capita emissions by final demand, that is not just by recognizing the role of trade, how much emissions are generated in terms of the consumption pattern. And you find the US is way ahead of everybody else. It's 18.1 metric tons per year. This is a 2015 estimate, but it would be slightly lower, maybe 17 metric tons today. And the others are Japan, Germany, okay, much, much higher than Russia, which is an oil exporter. You would expect an oil exporter to have high carbon emissions, right? But the big ones, therefore, are really European countries, France, Germany, UK, Italy. China is relatively small. It's 1/3, less than 1/3 of the US. And India is really small. It's 1.5 metric tons, which is around the same as sub-Saharan Africa, which is about 1.2 metric tons. So you see there's massive inequality still in terms of per capita emissions. And it's still dominated by the rich countries. This is excluding the carbon debt. This is just the current emissions. On the other hand, look who's going to suffer. Now, this is in terms of GDP. I'm not a big fan of GDP as a measure of human progress, but let's face it, it does determine incomes and ability to pay for all of this. And it turns out that many of the rich countries that were responsible for the problem, most of Europe, Russia, North America, especially Canada, are not really going to lose. In fact, they're going to gain from the climate change. Whereas the countries that lose a lot, and in some cases, massive, massive reductions in terms of the impact on GDP, are all in the developing world: South Asia, Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia as well. So there is an inequality in terms of who's caused the problem and who's going to suffer from the problem. But there is also this inequality, which is now estimating it in terms of the share of the global income distribution. And this is something from the World Inequality Lab. As you know, Lucas Chancel, Gabriel Zuckman, and others, they've been doing some very interesting work on climate inequality. And here you're looking at wealth. Okay, who has the wealth ownership and who's going to lose out the most and who's been responsible for the emissions. Okay, so the proportion of the losses, the proportion of the emissions, and the capacity to finance. So no surprises, but still very depressing to see that the bottom half of the global population is going to face 3/4 of the losses. It's only been responsible for 12% of the emissions, or currently is responsible for only 12% of the emissions, but it has only 2% of the capacity to finance. The top 10% of the global income distribution, it's exactly the other way around, okay? They have been responsible for about half of the emissions, right? Just the top 10% of the global population, responsible for half of the emissions. They are, on the other hand, hardly going to face any losses, only 3% of the relative losses. And of course, they're the ones who have the money to finance. Yeah, they have 3/4 of the available wealth to finance. So there is this fundamental inequality. And basically, we're not going to resolve this problem until we deal with this inequality. But I also want to remind you all that this is not just about North versus South or, rich countries versus everybody else, because we've all got our rich people, right? And what's quite interesting is that the bottom 50% of population, even in Europe and North America, emits less per capita than the top 10% in most other regions. The only region where they don't emit less than is Sub-Saharan Africa. Otherwise, you look at South and Southeast Asia, it's the top 10% emit more than the bottom half of Europe and North America. In fact, significantly more than Europe, okay? And North America, once again, it's outside the pack, right? It's way ahead of everybody else in terms of the most terrible emissions. But there is a fundamental inequality even within our countries and our regions. And so you have to bear that one in mind as well. Now, what does that mean? It means that if we reduce inequality, then poverty eradication is compatible with climate change mitigation. In so many of our countries, we're constantly being told that, we need to develop, and so we can't develop unless we're allowed to emit coal and do this and do that. That's not true. It's within country inequality accounts for 2/3 of carbon emissions. And this is across regions, okay? And in fact, the bottom half of the population in every region has been reducing its emissions over the last decade. It's the rich that are going absolutely out of the park. They are the ones whose emissions are growing. If you actually wanted to lift the 1/3 of the world's population that are supposed under the World Bank's poverty line, you would increase global carbon emissions by only 5%. But meanwhile, the top 10%, as I showed you, are accounting for half of the total emissions. And the top 1% are accounting for 15% of the emissions, just the top 1% of the world's population. So if you actually did a wealth tax on centimillionaires, that is those who have assets of more than 100 million. Here I've mentioned the estimate for 1.5% wealth tax. Gabriel Zucman has recently come up with a demand for a 2% tax on either wealth on incomes on ultra rich. And he's estimating that this would, if you go only for the billionaires of the world, you are going to get 250 billion per year. And this you compare with the adaptation funding needs of low and middle income countries. Currently, that's around 200 billion. So you will get more just on this 2% tax on billionaires than you would need for adaptation every year. Meanwhile, of course, there was a famous 100 billion that was promised to developing countries way back in 2012. And what has been the achievement so far? Not any of these years has it actually been reached. Last year, they claimed, we finally reached it, but it turns out that no, it didn't actually make it to even 100 billion. Now, 100 billion is pathetic. It's a tiny amount relative to what is needed, right? Everybody estimates that we need 2 to 3 trillion in terms of mitigation needs. But it turns out that even these very low estimates are crazy overestimates, because in fact, anything can be used to say it's climate finance. There is still 10 years later, 12 years later, actually, there is still no accepted definition of what climate finance is. So you can state that it is climate finance, it's up to you. And so, for example, there was a Reuters investigation, a subsidy by Italy for a retailer to open chocolate and gelato stores across Asia is part of climate finance. Hard to figure that one out, right? Is it because gelato will make you feel cooler? I don't know. A coastal hotel expansion in Haiti with a loan from the US. That's climate finance of the US. How is that climate finance when you know that coastal hotels are a real problem with the rising sea levels? Maybe it's got a seawall, and therefore. There was a love story set in the Argentine rainforest, and Belgium subsidized the making of that film. That's climate finance. Why? I guess rainforests are climate, right? Good climate, I don't know. Japan finances a new coal plant in Bangladesh. Coal, for God's sake. Why? Because it's supposed to be a green method of production of coal. And airport expansion in Egypt, we know that airplanes are part of the problem. Air travel is part of the problem. So in a sense, you can say anything that uses green technology, which again, we don't have a definition, is used to claim climate finance. And even a lot of these are not grants, they are loans. So when somebody tells you, oh yes, the rich countries are giving 100 billion or 88 billion or whatever, don't take it seriously. It's actually no money coming at all. Meanwhile, even before the Ukraine war, fossil fuel subsidies were around 6 trillion. Okay, this is an estimate from the IMF, 5.8 trillion actually. This is an estimate which looks at not just the explicit subsidies, which are the gray things down below, but the implicit subsidies, okay, the blue bars, which includes a whole range of, cheap credit, this, that, various other things. And the US alone is providing 700 billion per year as fossil fuel subsidy, compared to that pathetic amount that I mentioned of about 88 billion for supposed climate finance, most of which is not actually climate finance. So it's no surprise that, in fact, we keep getting more and more dirty investments. Now, all this is actually made worse by the debt crisis. And this is where we come to the debt issue and how that matters. In mid-2023, there were more than half of low-income countries in debt distress. Middle-income countries, there have been defaults in Sri Lanka, in Egypt and Pakistan, very severe debt stress. There have already been default events. And this is now a pattern. There's a kind of synchronized defaults by a bunch of countries that has happened in different periods. But this is clearly one of those periods where many, many countries are facing severe debt stress. Even the ones that are not defined as experiencing debt stress are spending huge amounts on debt service. But here's the thing. It's not because these low and middle income countries are being profligate. So what does that mean? It means, so look at the column, the chart on the left. That's the gross government debt to GDP, right? And that's supposed to be the indicator of how badly behaved a government has been, how fiscally irresponsible. So the rich countries in the COVID era, they massively increased their public spending. Okay, and so the debt to GDP ratio on average went up to 123% of GDP. That's just the average. Some countries, as you know, Japan, it's nearly 300% of GDP. It came down a little bit thereafter, but it's still 112% of GDP. Middle income countries, they went up to 66%, but it's still really low, right? And it stayed at around that level, 68%. But look at the low income countries. They have less than half a proportion. The government debt to GDP ratio is less than 50%, which would not be seen as a problem anywhere. And yet, look what happens on the right-hand side. This is the spread on sovereign debt compared to the US Treasury rate, okay? And the blue line is the advanced economies. If that looks flat, it's because it is. It's because the advanced economies, the spread over their sovereign debt over this entire period when they were spending so much more, when they were being fiscally profligate, et cetera, did not increase. It remained below 1 basis point. But look what happens to middle and low income countries. It goes bananas, right? Dramatic increase in the middle of COVID, as you can see, the first spike, and then an even more dramatic increase, and then it stays high during the beginning of the Ukraine war and thereafter. So here they are doing everything that they're told to do, behaving very fiscally, not spending on their citizens in the middle of a major health crisis, not providing social protection, not spending more on health, being good, and yet they get absolutely slammed by the capital markets, okay? And this is because they were able to take debts on in the period when the rich countries decided to have very loose monetary policies, right, after the global financial crisis. And so now they have all this legacy capital in their countries. And the minute you have all that legacy capital, number one, when the rich countries decide to have tight money policy, raise their interest rates, then obviously global interest rates rise. And so immediately, not only does the global rate rise, but your spread over the global rate rises. You saw what I showed you. That was an average of 7 percentage point increase in the spread, okay, on the bonds. But in fact, in any case, even after all of these spreads, you still are faced with lower capital inflow. There is a capital flight back to safety, so-called. The minute the interest rates rise, capital flows back to the US, to Northern Europe, to Japan, and so on. And so, in fact, these are by region, as you can see. The spreads in Asia haven't gone up so much, but in sub-Saharan Africa, they have gone up to more than 8 percentage points, okay, 812 basis points. And that's a dramatic increase even from the previous year. So they're really getting hammered by global financial markets, not because of their overspending. And in fact, currently, the low-income countries, they have to spend nearly double of what they spend on all other forms of social spending. That is health, education, social protection, taken together. They are spending more on that. 171% of what they're spending on health, education, social protection is being spent on debt service. Middle-income countries also are spending more than that, 104%. They're spending more on debt service than on all of these essentials. It's only the upper middle middle-income countries that are spending less. Now, obviously, that means that if you're not even going to be spending on these basics, you're not spending on public investment. You're not spending, let's say, on climate change mitigation even. You're not spending on adaptation or response to a climate shock or to any other shock. But it's also worse than that. The fact that you have to earn more foreign exchange means you need more brown and fossil fuel investment. And this is true of many countries, not just the ones that are called debt stressed, because as I told you, the low and middle income countries are spending so much, more than 15% of all their revenues, everything. So they really don't, anything that gives them more foreign exchange, they are desperate for it. Chad, which was facing a major debt crisis, was delighted when it discovered oil, because it could actually then start generating foreign exchange. And even a minor shock is very, very difficult to finance. So now all these countries are doing what is called Ponzi borrowing. You know, it's when you borrow to actually repay your debts. You borrow from X to repay Y, okay? And of course, it's even worse for countries that are especially vulnerable to climate shocks. The Caribbean countries, for example, the small island developing states, they are known to be more vulnerable and they are known to be less resilient. That is, they have less incomes, less assets, and they already face higher borrowing costs in the financial markets. And if there is any climate shock, then the spread increases further. And it happens even if there's a climate shock in a neighboring country. Bermuda gets something, then Jamaica is affected. But you know, that same pattern is not true for rich countries. So it's compounding the problem for low and middle income countries. But in rich countries that face climate shocks, they don't face that same increase in borrowing costs. Meanwhile, you have the international financial institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the regional development banks. Now, they're supposed to be doing the opposite. They're supposed to be providing counter-cyclical lending. They're supposed to give more money when the private markets are giving less, right? Now, this is what's happening. The left side is telling you what's happening to private markets. And as you can see, they've collapsed, right? They are now negative this year. But even these international financial institutions, the World Bank Group, the IMF, etc., they are giving less than they were giving before. Every single one of them is giving significantly less. Look at the last column on the right. In 2023, than they were giving in 2022. In other words, they are also being pro-cyclical. So it's a real mess. Even the institutions that were supposed to compensate for the private markets are adding to the problem. So what do? We obviously have to have major changes in the international economic architecture. First of all, when we're looking at climate obligations, we should use market exchange rates, not these purchasing power parity exchange rates to determine GDP. We should definitely bring in historical carbon debt and therefore consider shares of the future carbon budget on that basis, as well as per capita. At the moment, it's on aggregate, not per capita. We need massive climate finance increases based on global public investment. And that's basically the idea that if it's a global problem, it has to be solved with global spending. And so money should be allocated where it is needed, according to need, not as a kind of gift or a patronage from a rich country to a poor country, but wherever it will be the most effective instrument for addressing the climate challenge. And therefore, a new issue of special drawing rights of the IMF to be allocated selectively to countries in need. Of course, countries need resources, and one of the obvious ways for these resources is a taxation of multinational company profits and the extreme wealth of very, very rich individuals, okay? And there are very good proposals out there. I'm part, I think, as Pao mentioned, I'm part of a commission on independent commission on taxation, which we are actively pursuing both of these agendas. At the moment, multinationals pay a fraction of the taxes that a local company will pay because they can shift to these low tax jurisdictions. But this can be stopped, and there are easy ways to stop it. And we can also tax wealth if we simply agree to share information about who is holding the wealth where. And of course, we have to regulate and control the private finance that continues to fund brown projects. I'm not blaming them. It's because all the profitability is actually oriented in that direction. But we have to change that. We have to change those markets. And we have to share, of course, green technologies. And so that means changing the IPR regime and renegotiating TRIPS. About debt, the recent attempts to deal with it have failed. Okay, there was a debt suspension initiative during COVID-19. It only postponed payments. It didn't change the overall volumes of debt, and it didn't cover private and multilateral creditors. So then they tried the G20's common framework for debt treatment. It's a joke. Only 4 countries have applied. It's not 2 years now, it's 3 years. No country has yet got any outcome, if you can believe it. Private creditors have refused to participate or only will participate with very, very favorable terms. But there is legislation in New York, which is trying to bring sovereign debt in line with bankruptcy procedures that already exist in the US for local creditors. And this would be very important because the US and UK, London, New York and London are where 95% of sovereign debt is contracted. The multilateral institutions refuse to accept haircuts, but this is no longer acceptable. The IMF does a debt sustainability analysis, which is seen as the gold standard, but it has major flaws and it typically underestimates the extent of debt reduction that all creditors require. So, you know, when the attempts to deal with debt fail, then everyone says, oh, it's because of China. China is such a large creditor and it's not coming on board. But that's not true. It's really because China is making the same criticisms I have just made about the DSA, about the fact that multilateral institutions are not accepting haircuts. And so there are real problems with the design of the framework. So what can the IMF do? It can issue more special drawing rights, especially to help countries face crises that are not of their own making. It can stop charging surcharges on interest rates. So it's bad enough that the IMF then lends to countries, but when it lends a large amount or when it lends continuously, which is often its own fault, it then has a surcharge on the interest, which is huge. So countries in deep distress like Sri Lanka end up paying 8-9% for a loan from the IMF. It should change the DSA, the debt sustainability analysis framework. It should use a realistic macro model, which recognizes that if you're going to cut public spending and reduce subsidies and add more indirect taxes, that will contract the economy, not grow it. And the debt workouts must include a standstill on all debt payments during the negotiation process and automatic inclusion of private creditors through these legal changes that I've mentioned. So what can all of you demand? Finally, this is my last slide.
Okay,
what can all of you demand? You can demand regular allocation of IMF's SDRs every year, according to public need, according to, you know, whether you've got a climate shock or some other shock, a tax on the ultra-rich equivalent to 2% of asset value, immediate action on debt relief along the lines that I have suggested, a proper definition of climate finance. Surely that's not too much to ask. And then, therefore, an associated increase in rich countries' transfers and a reform of intellectual property rights regimes to allow access to green technologies to everyone. Okay, I have gone on for too long, apologies, but let's have the discussion now.